At 22, he arrived in the United States with empty pockets, broken English, and a heart heavy with unfulfilled promises. He washed dishes in silence, watching, dreaming, as life happened just beyond the kitchen door. But behind the burned hands and tired eyes, an impossible dream was growing: to open a restaurant where his mother's memory and the flavors of Mexico would have a seat at the table. 20 years of invisible struggle, and just when success finally arrived, the past came knocking, in handcuffs. What would you do if the country you helped build tried to erase you the moment you bloomed? This is the story of Mateo Rios, an immigrant, a dreamer, a survivor. And his restaurant carries more than flavor. It carries roots. The December wind cut like a blade through the streets of Queens. Mateo Rios hunched his shoulders inside the thin jacket he'd bought for $5 at a thrift store. It was his third week washing dishes at Alessandro Trattoria, an elegant-looking Italian restaurant with a kitchen that boiled like a cauldron of torment. "Más rápido, Rios!" shouted Carlo, the sous chef, a wrinkled-faced Sicilian with a sharp voice. "These dishes won't wash themselves!" Mateo didn't answer. He just lowered his head, his fingers already purple from the cold and burns, and kept scrubbing. He knew speaking meant making mistakes, and mistakes, in that place, meant disappearing. During his breaks, while eating a squashed sandwich in the back alley, Mateo watched through a crack in the kitchen door. He studied the chef's movements, the precise knife cuts, the drizzle of olive oil falling just right over the risotto, the coordinated shouting between cooks. It was a performance, and he was the invisible spectator. At night, in the tiny room he shared with 2 other immigrants, he stared at a faded photo of his mother. He remembered the smell of chicken broth with epazote she used to make on Sundays, the red dirt beneath his feet, the sound of church bells in the village where he was born. That hurt more than his cracked hands. "One day, Mama, one day you'll see my name on a sign." Deep in that cruel winter, a stubborn hope began to grow. It wasn't just hunger driving him. It was memory, longing, and a dream he didn't yet know how to name, but that already burned like fresh firewood on a stove. It was a Wednesday like any other when Mateo first heard the sound that would change his fate: steel striking the cutting board. He had just finished scrubbing a mountain of pans when he noticed Lorenzo, the executive chef, setting up the mise en place for dinner. Mateo couldn't look away. His eyes locked on the precision of the knife as it sliced through the carrot, turning it into paper-thin strips. Every movement had rhythm, as if Lorenzo were dancing. Mateo didn't know he was being watched. "Hey, dishwasher," Lorenzo said without looking up. "You want to learn, or just stand there drooling?" Mateo froze. His English was still shaky, but he understood the tone. He hesitated, then nodded. "Then pay attention. Knife is an extension of your hand, like music, like memory." In the days that followed, whenever Mateo managed to finish his shift early, he edged closer. Sometimes he got a minute of explanation, other times just an impatient glance. But he absorbed everything: the type of knife, the texture of the pasta, how to sear meat without losing its juice. He learned in silence, with hungry eyes. One especially chaotic night, Lorenzo shouted, "Mateo, come here. That's your name, right?" "Si, chef. I need a sub for prep. Don't make me regret this." With trembling hands, Mateo tied on his apron and grabbed the knife. He felt the weight, the edge, the story it carried. He chopped onions, cried more than necessary, but never lost his rhythm. At the end of the shift, Lorenzo tossed him a towel. "Not bad, Mexican. You've got a cook's hands." Mateo smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a crack in the wall separating him from his dream. Weeks turned into months. Mateo, now promoted to kitchen assistant, had earned quiet respect from the team. He worked double shifts without complaint. He observed, experimented, and scribbled recipes into a worn notebook he hid among the flour sacks. At night, he studied English with a beat-up radio and a list of taped-up vocabulary words on the wall. Everything seemed to be moving forward until the phone rang during his break. It was late at night. Mateo, sitting on the curb behind the restaurant, saw his sister's number blinking on the screen. He answered, heart already tightening. Hola! Mateo, Isabel's voice trembled. Mamá se fue. The world went silent for a moment. The city's noise vanished. ¿Cómo? ¿Qué estás diciendo? This morning, it was her heart. She was at the market. She collapsed. She didn't suffer, Mateo. Mateo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The call dropped, or maybe he simply couldn't hear anymore. He walked into the restaurant like a ghost, said nothing, washed his hands, tied his apron, and went back to chopping vegetables like nothing had happened. Mateo? Lorenzo noticed something was off. What's wrong? Mateo tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Tears streamed silently down onto the cutting board. My mom murió, he managed with the little English he knew. Lorenzo said nothing. He just handed him a glass of water and a piece of warm bread. That night, alone at home, Mateo cooked. He made his mother's chicken broth with epazote, just like she used to. He cried the entire time. But with the first spoonful, something shifted. He felt like she was sitting right there, across from him. In his grief, a certainty took root. He had to carry that flavor to the world. Time passed, but the pain remained. Mateo was now a full-time cook in Alessandro Trattoria's kitchen. He was no longer invisible. Some of his dishes made it onto the menu, even if others took the credit. He didn't complain. He knew this was only the beginning. Late at night, after the restaurant closed, Mateo used leftover ingredients to test his own recipes. He cooked in secret. Sometimes he recreated dishes from his childhood. Other times he tried blending Mexican ingredients with Italian techniques. Lorenzo discovered this by accident. What's this? Mateo froze with the spoon in hand. On the stove was a huitlacoche risotto with smoked Parmesan. Es algo mío, an experiment. Lorenzo tasted it silently, then looked at Mateo seriously. Where'd you learn this? Mi madre, mi tierra. Huitlacoche and Parmesan. Never thought of that. Strange, but good. In the following days, Mateo started arriving 2 hours early. Lorenzo, intrigued, encouraged him. You want to be a chef, Mateo? Si. Then stop copying others. Find your voice, your flavor. Mateo began a personal journey. He visited Latin markets in the Bronx and farmers markets in Brooklyn. He experimented with tamarind and wine reduction, mole with truffle, blue corn with seared scallops. He created dishes you couldn't find in any book. One night, he made an inverted taco, thin toasted masa filled with lamb ragu and agave emulsion. Lorenzo smiled. That's yours. That's new. Mateo felt something he never had before. Belonging. For the first time, he wasn't imitating. He was creating. And every flavor held pieces of his story, his mother, and his homeland. In that overheated kitchen, the seed of raíces was planted, even if he didn't yet know its name. 4 years had passed since that first bold risotto. Mateo saved every penny, shared an apartment with coworkers, and endured grueling work hours. His recipe notebook had grown thicker, his hands more calloused, but the dream burned brighter than ever. Mateo, why don't you open your own restaurant? Lorenzo asked one evening while they cleaned their knives. Mateo smiled, a bit embarrassed. Seems impossible.
The money, the papers, but someday. Every chef needs a place to call their own, a space where they don't have to hide their story. Lorenzo's words lit a spark. Matteo began looking for partners, making contacts, and learning about licenses and business management. Many doors closed in his face, but a small opportunity appeared when he met Clara, a journalist passionate about food and Latin culture. Clara believed in Matteo. She saw more than a cook. She saw a storyteller, someone carrying the voice of his people through food. "I'm going to help you," she said. "This won't be just a restaurant. It'll be an experience, a living narrative." Together, they began mapping a menu built on memory, struggle, and hope. They named the project Raíces, Roots, in honor of the land that had shaped him. When they finally found a small space on a quiet street in Queens, Matteo felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "This is the beginning," he whispered. On the first night of service, under soft lights and the aroma of spices, the door opened to their first customers. Matteo was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, but he could hear the murmurs of guests tasting something new, something real. In the crowd, among curious faces and full tables, an old friend approached, smiling. "I never doubted you, Matteo." The journey was far from over, but the dream had finally taken on a real flavor.
Raíces grew slowly but steadily, drawing the attention of critics and curious food lovers alike. Matteo's name began to circulate, along with his unique dishes that blended tradition with innovation. One rainy evening, while checking the stockroom inventory, Clara walked in with an envelope. "This came today. It's an invitation to a rising chef's event in Manhattan. Looks like a huge opportunity." Matteo held the paper, anxiety building in his chest. "But, Clara, that's outside of Queens. I don't know if I'm ready." "You're more than ready. They want to hear your story." On the day of the event, wearing his best apron, Matteo felt the weight of expectations. Among renowned chefs, he prepared his signature dish, mole de la memoria, a recipe his mother had taught him, reinvented with local ingredients. When the judges tasted it, they went silent. There was something in that mixture, not just flavors, but emotion that stirred something deeper. Afterwards, a man in a suit approached. "Mateo Rios? I'm Samuel King, editor-in-chief of Culinary Voices. I'd like to feature your story." Mateo swallowed hard. "Is this an opportunity?" "More than that, it's the recognition you deserve." But what seemed like a victory brought unexpected complications. Samuel had questions about Matteo's past, his origins, his documents. "We just want to make sure your story is real, that everything is in order." Matteo felt the system, the same one that had tried to crush him for years, re-emerge. Between hope and fear, he had to decide: open his past to the world or risk losing doors that might never open again. That night, alone, Matteo looked at his recipe notebook. Between those pages were more than just flavors. There were truths, scars, and the courage it would take to keep going.
News of the magazine's interest spread quickly, attracting both curious eyes and dangerous ones. That same week, the doorbell rang loudly in Matteo's small apartment. He opened the door and found two immigration officers standing firm and expressionless. "Matteo Rios, we need to talk." His heart pounded. Memories of sleepless nights and cruel bosses flooded back like a storm. Everything he had built now felt on the verge of collapse. "Please, I have papers in process. I work honestly. I have a restaurant." "We understand, but we need to verify some information." Matteo was taken in for questioning. The room was cold, impersonal. Sharp questions, suspicious glances. The system that had rejected him now stared at him like a criminal. Meanwhile, Clara scrambled to gather lawyers and support. The local community began to mobilize. Customers and coworkers wrote letters, held quiet protests outside Raíces. "You're not alone," Clara said, holding his hand. In the kitchen, the silence was overwhelming. The restaurant closed temporarily. Mateo, in isolation, found strength in the messages of hope that poured in. On his last night before the final decision, he wrote a letter to his mother, not to be sent, just a confession, a release. "Mama, I came here with nothing, only dreams. They told me I didn't belong. But here I am, still standing. Raíces isn't just a restaurant, it's who I am. If I have to leave, I want them to know I fought to the end." The early morning brought silence and uncertainty. The future stood in front of him like a locked door, heavy and unforgiving. Months later, the verdict finally arrived. Mateo was granted permission to stay, thanks to the support from the community and pressure from the media. Raíces reopened its doors with a simple yet deeply emotional ceremony. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating food," Clara said during the opening speech. "We're celebrating the courage of someone who never gave up." Mateo, eyes full of emotion, looked around the packed dining room. Among the guests were old friends, loyal customers, and even people who had once ignored him. In the crowd, a familiar face appeared. It was Elena, his sister, who had come from Mexico to surprise him. "Mateo," she said, embracing him tightly, "Mama would be so proud." That night, as the restaurant buzzed with laughter and conversation, Mateo stepped into the kitchen. He opened the notebook he'd kept since the beginning of his journey. He selected a special dish, chicken broth with epazote, just like his mother used to make. As he served it to the table, he realized this was more than food. It was a story of struggle, love, and belonging. Raíces had become more than a restaurant. It was a home, a bridge between past and future, between Mexican roots and American soil. And for the first time in 20 years, Mateo smiled without fear, knowing that he had finally found his place in the world.